How are you?
I'm doing well. I mean, this is so nice. It's really a kind of a nice format to be able to do this on Zoom. It is so wonderful for connections like this.
I agree. And the beauty of it as well, you're my very first American artist as well.
Really?
You are indeed.
Oh, honor.
I discovered your work about 10 years ago, and I was drawn to the way that you combine stitch with very delicate natural materials like seed pods and leaves. Have you always stitched, and how did you start working on botanical embroideries?
Okay, so I have always stitched. I think I've always been kind of drawn to the textile arts. And so I have always done that, but I didn't really, recognize that that was like a thing that you could do in life until much later. And so I guess I'll just kind of like tell the story of how this kind of went for me. I went to a summer camp when I was about 14 years old that was centered around learning about nature and ecosystems and how to be a conscious consumer, basically stewardship of the land. And I fell in love with that place. So when I was 14, that was like this turning point for me where I decided, oh, there's this, like this is something that I want to be in my life forever. And so I was thinking at that point, like I will just become a, botanist or a biologist or do, something in environmental conservation. And then I got to be at the age where you have to decide what you're going to do when you go into college. And I was kind of stuck between science or art. It turned out that I just got a really wonderful scholarship to go to school for art. And so that's kind of what I did. It's amazing how you kind of just sometimes let fate take the wheel and these things work out as they do. And when I was a junior, so in my third year, I studied abroad in Manchester. Yeah, and that was amazing. I studied specifically at Manchester Metropolitan University. They had a specific program that was just for embroidery. And so that was where I really started to fall in love with the complexity of these stitches and the history. And I was exposed to just so many artists who were working in a very serious way. And that was totally eye-opening for me. So while I was there studying, I fell in love with insertion stitching, which are a traditional joining stitch. So it's utilitarian stitch meant to bring two pieces of fabric together, but they're also beautiful and decorative. And you see them historically on a lot of crazy quilts or scrap quilts to join those pieces of fabric together. And so I was doing that and just joining, scraps of fabric together that I found, like socks from the back of the dryer that I would collect, and even the clothing tags inside my clothes. So I was working at a very small scale at that point because I knew that everything that I made had to fit back in my suitcase when I left. And I eventually did leave, of course, and then immediately went back to the United States, and it was the summer. So I was working at the summer camp that I have mentioned before. So I went through my whole teenager years going back to this camp and volunteering. And I remember just sitting out on the back deck of the kitchen and looking up at a tree, and there was just this giant, beautiful oak tree above me. And I was like, I wonder if I could possibly stitch leaves. And so that was, the very first sort of instigation of testing this out, and it worked. So I did it the next day, it worked. And that was this moment for me of like feeling just like something had clicked. And I was finally very interested in what I was doing. Like, not that I was very interested in the stitching before, but I didn't have necessarily like the conceptual backing for it. And not that all happened at once, of course, but it just felt like something was in the right place. And so the more that I kind of worked with the leaves, the more I thought about, okay, I'm using these joining stitches to bring, either different leaves together or different parts of the leaf together physically, but then conceptually eventually I was kind of thinking, okay, but I'm also bringing nature and the human hand together through this process. And so that's kind of what the focus became for me. And that's still today what I think about all the time. You know, regardless of whether you live in a city or in the country, there's trees everywhere and leaves everywhere. And most of the time, you know, I try not to pick them directly out of someone's yard or garden. But there's plenty to go around. And I love that it's really a material that, you know, to me, it's kind of like a representative. Leaf is a representative of nature. It's kind of this iconic material, but also it's totally renewable, and generally the tree doesn't mind sharing. So I have, I don't know if you can see here, but I have this leaf, this big elephant ear leaf, and we do, we can grow those here in Virginia, but they're really more of a tropical plant. So I don't have very many leaves that are not from this area.
Can we talk about some of your processes? Because you do a lot of cut work, and I want to talk about the cyanotypes later on, about your big project. So your techniques involve stitching, but you also incorporate cut work into your designs. Do you find that the leaf itself dictates what the design is going to be, or do you have a design in your head that you want to translate onto the leaf?
I think absolutely the leaf dictates. And at this point, I kind of know the properties of a lot of the leaves that I use frequently, and what they'll withstand and what they won't, and ways to get around that, maybe, or push something to the very edge of what, you know, what the capabilities are of the material. But I mean, it's just, at first I was cutting just like very simple windows into the leaves and stitching on those, and then I realized that I could actually get a little bit more complex and detailed with those cuts, and certain leaves really withstand that quite well, and certain leaves don't. So it's kind of been this learning process to figure out what I can do and with what material. And the same goes for stitching. I mean, I feel like, you know, at this point, 15 years in, I'm kind of like cooking with fire now, but back when I started this, it was a lot of trial and error, and a lot of ripping through leaves and ruining, you know, things that I had started, and it was quite frustrating sometimes, really. But I think I've gotten to a point where I understand what I'm doing and what, you know, how far I can push. And of course, like, you know, I've learned to be incredibly gentle with the leaves and use my hands in a very, I guess, sensitive way. You know, there's no tugging. You know, if there's even the slightest bit of resistance, you know, the thread is maybe twisted on itself or something, that's like a moment where I have to, you know, stop what I'm doing, flip it over, untwist everything, and then pull the needle through. There's no jerking, no pulling hard, you know, that's just the recipe for ruining what I'm working on. So I have to be really present and aware of what I'm doing. As far as stitches that I use, I'm really interested in learning new stitches all the time, but I tend to just use this, you know, very like simple running stitches, back stitches. Right now I'm working on a project and just using a few French knots, but mostly couching. So that's these, which I think I sent you an image of, but that's just all couching. Typically I'll kind of have, you know, a commission or a project, a show coming up that I know I'm gonna need, you know, I'll have an idea of what I kind of want to do, and so I'll seek out the leaves that I know are going to work for that idea. And the process, I guess I can describe the process. So what I'll do is I'll go and pick just, just a leaf. I'll get, the leaves that I want to use. And then I usually, depending on the leaf, will press it for a few days so it's nice and flat. And then I have my sketchbook that I use all the time. I love working in my sketchbook. I don't do it as much as I would like to, but it is something that I do quite frequently. So then what I'll do, if it's a very specific project and it's going to be pretty planned out, I'll go ahead and trace that leaf right into my sketchbook. So here, and then I'll draw what I want. And then sometimes I'll even make like a paper pattern of that shape if I'm going to use that shape repeatedly in multiple pieces so that they're exactly the same or, roughly the same. And then I'll take that paper piece and either trace it on the back of the leaves that I'm going to work on or just draw it freehand, depending. Most of the time I draw it freehand on the back of the leaf so that at least I have a pattern to use while I'm stitching. And that's one thing that I actually haven't had wonderful luck with, is finding the right pen or marker that works on the back of the leaves, because sometimes, actually there's these two. So on the back of some leaves, this is the back, and you can see that it's actually pretty clean. But this one is a different variety of magnolia, and it has this brown, almost fur. It feels kind of very velvety, like flocking, and that will eventually rub off if you're kind of like working the piece. That'll eventually rub off. So if I draw a pattern or something on the leaf that has this type of material on the back, it doesn't always work out so well, and by the time I'm done stitching, the drawing is almost gone. So I have to just have a good idea of what I wanted in the first place, which is why the sketchbook comes in really handy. Some of them are stabilized just by pressing. So I press them before I work on them, and I press them afterwards until they're ready to be framed. And then they're framed using all archival materials and museum glass, which has a UVA coating on it to protect from the sun. But other leaves that are a little bit more delicate or fragile, sometimes what I do is use a coating of an archival glue called PVA, which I don't know if you have, but we have here, and it's just, it's actually for bookmaking. So I'll sometimes use a coating of that, but only on the back of the leaf. And what that does is help to stabilize a little bit, just the in between the veins of the leaf. If you're pushing through with a needle, that does help to just have like something there to catch, like so that the material doesn't just push straight through, if that makes sense. At first, when I started doing this, I was stabilizing the leaves with like a similar substance that would just coat the front and the back. But then I noticed when I started either cutting or stitching, that coating would actually pop off and flake where the needle punched through. And I really didn't like that. And I kind of just, I like the idea of the leaf just being the leaf. So as frequently as possible, I don't like to put any coating on it. But there are some leaves that it's just not possible to stitch. I've done some stitching on rose petals and ginkgo leaves, which are just so fragile in the way that their vein structure works, that they need that extra little bit of support. So this series, the Blue Iris series, I have 4 of these now, which actually doesn't seem like very many, but it's quite a large number of hours that go into them. And they're all done with couching. But I was really interested to use more color and a more heavy stitching than I have before. And I just started this rather recently. I think in March I started doing this. So these pieces are inspired by, well, they're partially inspired actually by this tin that I have here that was my grandmother's, and I don't know if you can see, this always sat on her kitchen counter, and it was full of tea bags. And so I always remember that from when I was a little kid, and I always loved those tins. That was the first thing when she passed away, and my mom said, well, do you want anything from Grandma's house? I said, I want those tins. And so the Blue Iris series is partially inspired by those, but it's actually a part of a new body of work that I've been working on recently, which is a commission actually to go to the US Embassy in Sri Lanka. So yeah, it's a wonderful, exciting project. But this is the second piece in the series, and so each piece is comprised of several different leaves in an arrangement, and so I'm very slowly working on that. Unfortunately, this process is incredibly tedious and slow, but it's so rewarding, and it's the first thing that I've been truly excited about maybe since the cyanotype project. So yeah. So Courting Spring it's also a part of a series that's a much larger arrangement. But those two pieces to me are the pieces that stood out and sort of shifted the way that I was thinking about creating the work that I'm currently making. So it's kind of, those pieces came before the Blue Iris series, and every time I make one of these pieces that are more involved and more colorful and use this kind of elaborate couching, I learn something. And so it's not necessarily like learning a different technique, but just learning how, if you layer the thread like this, you kind of get a little bit more depth, or using these two colors together really, from a distance looks like one color. Things like that. And so I think that was a particularly important step for me with those pieces, just in terms of how the couching could really work in this different way than I had been thinking about. And it's really bright. Those colors are not colors that I would typically be drawn to. And I'm so glad that I just did something that was a little bit out of my, my comfort zone, because it's exciting and different and has led me down a different path.
So let's talk about your cyanotype project.
Okay. Yeah.
Very exciting cyanotype project. So another way that you incorporate leaves into your art is through cyanotypes. And last year you took it to a whole new level with a beautiful piece of public art called Botanical Blueprint. What was the inspiration behind that project?
Oh, the inspiration behind that project. So that project was the biggest project that I've ever done. And it started with a smaller project here in Richmond, Virginia, that I did in collaboration with a wonderful non-for-profit gallery that we have here called 1708 Gallery. 1708 Gallery was just down the street from where I used to live in a very historically Black neighborhood. And I wrote a proposal that I sort of take stock of the neighborhood, both the people and the plants that were there, and see what relationships existed between them. And so that was the sort of seed for this larger project that I did with the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, New York. It was in conjunction with the Buffalo Garden Walk, which is a festival that has happened for many, many years. Everyone opens up their gardens and does garden tours, and it's this like kind of exciting community event. And so the setup was that people were also invited to come and make a cyanotype print of a plant if they wanted to, and I would keep a copy and then they could take a copy. So it was just a big day of printing and showing people this process and getting them excited about, making art in a simple way that's accessible for everybody. And we did it in two different locations. So the first location was this really busy traffic circle, and we just got tons of people who were just walking by. And the second location was very close to where the mural actually ended up being put. And it's on the west side of Buffalo, and that is an area where there's a lot of refugee communities. So the feeling is very different, and the plants are really different. So we were able to make prints that were actually representative of the plants that that people there were familiar with, which is fantastic, because I think it speaks to this larger idea that plants are a symbol of our home, and we carry that with us wherever we go. I don't know if I really mentioned this before, but I do think that the relationship between plants and people is so important, and is something that, you know, we tend not to think about as much in, you know, our busy daily lives, but it's something that's, you know, kind of intrinsic in who we are and our connection to the land. And so that's something that I'm just thinking about as I'm working, and in all of this work, I think that's sort of central to what I'm doing, is trying to just highlight that or elevate that connection between plants and people.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you.
It is so wonderful. It's so lovely to meet you. I hope maybe in the future our paths can cross in some way again, maybe if I ever get over there. Yeah, in the future when things are back to more normal, I would love to have an exhibition on your side of the pond. But I would love a reason to come back to Manchester and visit again. I would love to spend time there again.